He was a humble physician from a Prussian province. He discovered the symptoms of a disease not described in medical treatises. He became a pioneer whose name became etched in medical history. Yet, his triumph turned into personal tragedy, and recognition only came decades after his death. Great discoveries are rarely born in quiet studies or flashes of insight. They are not instantaneous breakthroughs of genius. They are a long, often exhausting struggle against inertia, ignorance, and entrenched dogmas, a struggle that demands sacrifice. Imagine a world where medicine was more an art of divination than a precise science. A world where illness was perceived as divine punishment, the work of evil spirits, or an imbalance of mythical humors in the body. This was the 19th century, but in many European clinics, time seemed to have stood still in the Middle Ages. Physicians relied on ancient texts riddled with misconceptions and on intuition, which too often led to disasters. Diagnoses were based on external symptoms, without a true understanding of internal processes. Bloodletting was performed indiscriminately, believed to remove bad humors, but only weakening the patient. Concepts of anatomy were rudimentary, and physiology was virtually non-existent. Hygiene? The word hadn't yet entered the medical lexicon. Operations were conducted in unsanitary conditions, often directly on the dirty floors of hospitals that more closely resembled hospices for the dying. Instruments were not sterilized. Surgeons, their hands covered in blood from previous patients, would proceed to the next amputation without hesitation. Wounds were cauterized with hot irons or doused with boiling oil to stop bleeding and cleanse damaged tissues. Pus flowing from wounds was not seen as a sign of deadly infection, but as a laudable phenomenon, evidence that the body was expelling the disease. Millions died not from the disease itself, but from the consequences of such treatment, infections, sepsis, and septic shock. Postoperative mortality reached a staggering 80 or even 90%. In this world, where pain was everyone's constant companion and death a frequent and merciless visitor, the authority of the past was unshakable. Medical dogmas, shaped over centuries and enshrined in university curricula, were as solid as granite. Any new knowledge, any observation that contradicted established beliefs, was met with fierce resistance. Questioning the truth of ancient teachings was akin to heresy, and attempting to change treatment methods was deemed quackery. This was a world with no place for revolutionary ideas, for those who dared to look beyond the familiar horizon, a world desperately in need of enlightenment, yet resisting it with all its might, guarded by fear and prejudice. Carl von Basedow was one of those who dared. He was born in the Westphalian town of Minden, received a classical education, and then went to Halle to study medicine. Not in metropolitan universities where dogmas reigned, but in a provincial one where practical experience was valued above scholasticism. Upon completing his studies, the young physician returned to his hometown. He began working at the local hospital. Every day he saw the same thing, an endless stream of patients admitted with common injuries, but dying from what doctors called hospital fever. He saw how the simplest fractures turned into gangrene, how innocent cuts led to amputation. He observed surgeons whose hands, having just held bloodied scalpels, immediately touched new wounds. He saw how purulent discharges were considered normal and death an inevitability. These scenes did not align with what he read in old books. Something was wrong. Not with the patients, not with the diseases, but with the approach itself. It was not divine punishment, but something created by human hands. Basedow didn't just doubt, he sought answers. His office became a laboratory, and his hospital a field for observation. He began keeping meticulous records. He compared symptoms, treatment methods, and outcomes. He saw patterns that no one before him had noticed. One day, during an operation, as the surgeon prepared to cauterize a wound with a hot iron to stop bleeding, it was discovered there was no oil left for cauterization. The standard method was unavailable. This was a critical moment. Most doctors would have postponed the operation or found a substitute. But Basedow, who had long questioned the harm of such procedures, saw an opportunity. He decided to go against established practice. He instructed his assistants not to use cauterization. Instead, he meticulously cleaned the wound using pure water. Then he applied a dressing of clean cloth soaked in a solution he had prepared himself based on his observations of natural wound healing processes. He didn't rely on the doctrine of bad humors, but trusted the power of cleanliness and natural healing processes. The next day, when he removed the dressing, he saw no pus. The wound was clean. It began to close. The patient did not suffer from fever. This was not an isolated case. He repeated his method again and again. Each time, the results were the same: fewer infections, faster healing, lower mortality. He wasn't just treating symptoms, he was changing outcomes. He began to see not just diseases, but their causes. Basedow didn't just change one method, he laid the foundation for a new philosophy of treatment. His breakthrough was not an epiphany, but the result of dispassionate observation. He was an empiricist. Every day, for many years, he recorded everything: the condition of wounds, treatment methods, bodily reactions, and outcomes. His notes became not just a diary, but an extensive database. In them, he saw what eluded others: the invisible connections between dirt and death, cleanliness and healing. He didn't believe in mystical humors or divine punishment. He believed in evidence, in what he saw with his own eyes. His office transformed into a research hub. He didn't just clean wounds with water, he experimented. He tried different solution concentrations, different dressing materials. He learned from every case, every mistake. If a patient didn't recover, Basedow didn't attribute it to fate. He analyzed. What went wrong? Perhaps the cloth wasn't clean enough. Perhaps the solution was too weak. He constantly refined his approach, honing it down to the smallest detail. He understood that success depended on the minutiae: boiling water, using fresh bandages, meticulous hand disinfection. These simple truths seemed heretical in a world where surgeons prided themselves on blood-stained aprons. He was not only a physician, but also an innovative thinker. To ensure cleanliness, Basedow initiated the creation of new instruments and procedures. He developed instruments that were easier to sterilize, advocated for separate basins for water, and clean towels for each patient. He didn't just treat, he created a system where cleanliness became the primary tool. But how could he convey these discoveries to colleagues encased in the armor of dogma? Academic publications were written in Latin, accessible only to a narrow elite, and often disdained practical experience. Basedow made a bold decision. He began publishing his observations and methods in his native German. This was a revolutionary step. His works became accessible to a wide range of physicians who, like him, worked in the provinces and faced daily tragedies. He didn't wait for recognition from metropolitan professors. He appealed directly to those who fought for lives daily. He described his methods in such detail that any practicing physician could replicate them. He provided not abstract theories but concrete instructions: how much water, how often to change dressings, what to pay attention to. His publications were not dry scientific treatises. They were calls to action, backed by hundreds of cases from his practice, with specific mortality figures before and after the implementation of his methods. He didn't just describe successes, he honestly reported on difficulties, on cases where his methods didn't work, and what conclusions he drew from them. This openness, this willingness to admit and analyze failures, was another of his tools, a tool for teaching and persuasion. He proved not with words, but with results, and these results were more eloquent than any ancient texts. His publications did not go unnoticed. They became a challenge not just to individual doctors, but to the entire hierarchy, to all the centuries-old foundations upon which medical science rested. Professors from metropolitan universities, whose names adorned multi-volume works, saw a threat in the provincial physician Basedow. A threat to their authority, a threat to their world, built on Latin, ancient axioms, and the infallibility of tradition. They could not accept that answers to eternal questions could come not from scholarly treatises, but from dirty hospital wards. Quackery thundered in academic circles. Dangerous experiments, they echoed. His methods were called reckless, his records falsified, and he himself, in their opinion, was nothing more than an upstart disgracing the noble title of physician. They accused him of undermining trust in classical medicine, questioning the authority of great predecessors like Galen and Hippocrates. How dared this provincial claim that cleanliness was more important than bloodletting, that water could heal better than a hot iron? For them, this was not merely a scientific misconception, it was an assault on fundamental principles. Colleagues, accustomed to old methods and unwilling to change their habits, felt insulted. Their reputation, their many years of experience, all of it was called into question. Some filed official complaints with medical boards demanding an investigation into his activities, citing unacceptable deviations from protocol and irresponsible innovation. There were calls to revoke his medical license. His works were conspicuously ignored in leading scientific journals, and his name became synonymous with eccentricity and dangerous freethinking. But Basedow also had supporters. These were not academics, but those who, like him, saw dying patients every day and were weary of the impotence of old medicine. Young doctors, open to new ideas, read his works. They saw in them not heresy, but hope for saving lives. Crucially, they saw real, undeniable results. At the Minden Hospital where Basedow worked, post-operative mortality plummeted tenfold. Where previously 9 out of 10 patients died, now 7 or even 8 survived. These figures spoke for themselves. They were the best argument. Among his patrons were not only physicians, but also influential officials. Some statesmen concerned by the catastrophic mortality in overcrowded hospitals began to listen carefully to Basedow. The provincial governor, whose family had also suffered from hospital infections, personally took an interest in his work. He visited the Minden Hospital and saw the striking difference with his own eyes. He saw clean wards, healing wounds, patients who didn't suffer from hospital fever and recovered quickly. This was not a miracle, but the result of a systematic approach to cleanliness. Pressure on Basedow mounted. He was summoned to a hearing before the Prussian Medical Council. This was not merely an interrogation, but a true trial of his ideas and his entire practice. The accusations were serious, from violating medical ethics to practices endangering patients' lives. The hearing room was packed, medical elite representatives, officials, journalists. On one side were distinguished professors, clad in official attire, with volumes of ancient folios on their tables, ready to unleash the full force of academic dogma upon him. On the other, Carl von Basedow. Alone. But behind him stood not only his meticulously documented records, but also hundreds of saved lives. He did not defend himself with words or philosophical arguments. He brought his diaries, thousands of entries, each containing a detailed description of a case, symptoms, treatment methods, bodily reactions, outcomes. He presented statistics, figures that could not be disputed, comparative tables of mortality in his hospital versus mortality in other clinics using traditional methods. He showed blueprints of his sterilization devices, explained the logic of each step, from boiling water to changing dressings. He spoke not of theories, but of facts, of what he saw, of what he did. The session lasted 2 days. Professors tried to catch him in errors, pointed out deviations from accepted methods, and quoted Latin treatises. But Basedow countered every argument, referencing his records, concrete results, and recovery stories. He did not argue with authorities, he presented evidence, and this evidence was irrefutable. Ultimately, the Prussian Medical Council rendered its decision. They could not ignore the presented facts. They could not deny the dramatic drop in mortality. Basedow was not merely acquitted, his methods were recognized as revolutionary and recommended for implementation. The council mandated other hospitals to study and apply his principles of cleanliness and antisepsis. This was a turning point. The provincial physician, who just yesterday was called a charlatan, became a pioneer whose ideas changed the future of medicine. His triumph was not a personal victory, but a triumph of reason over prejudice, evidence over dogma, and light over the darkness of ignorance. The Prussian Medical Council's decision became a decree. It immediately transformed medical practice across Prussia. Hospitals, which just yesterday were mired in filth, received clear directives. Doctors were ordered to wash their hands. Instruments were now boiled before every operation. Dressing materials were steam sterilized. Septic wards were separated from clean ones. The results were immediate. Within a few years after the implementation of Basedow's principles, post-operative mortality in Prussian hospitals plummeted from 80% to less than 10%, where previously only 1 patient in 10 survived, now 9 were saved. Hospital fever, the scourge of the 19th century, virtually disappeared. Wounds healed faster. Patients recovered visibly. This was not a miracle. It was the consequence of cleanliness. This was not merely a set of new rules. It was a paradigm shift. Medical universities began to revise their curricula. Courses on hygiene and antisepsis became mandatory. Students were taught not only anatomy, but also the basics of microbiology, though Basedow himself did not yet know of the existence of bacteria. His conclusions were based purely on empiricism. Future doctors now spent hours in laboratories, studying water purity, analyzing the quality of dressing materials. They learned not only to treat, but also to prevent. Every student was required to master sterilization techniques, the rules of asepsis and antisepsis. This was a radical departure from previous scholastic teaching methods. New positions emerged: hospital hygienists. Governments began allocating funds for the reconstruction of old hospitals. They designed new ones, incorporating principles of ventilation, isolation, and sanitation. Centralized sterilization departments were created. The production of sterile bandages and instruments became a separate, rapidly growing industry. Medical journals, which had recently ignored Basedow, now published articles about his methods. They became a model to emulate. Hospitals themselves were transformed. From places where people came to die, they became centers of healing. Building architecture changed: wide windows for light and air, smooth surfaces that were easy to clean, water supply systems to ensure cleanliness. All of this was a direct consequence of his ideas. Basedow's influence extended beyond Prussia. His works, written in German, were quickly translated. They spread throughout Europe. British, French, and Austrian physicians studied his experience. Although Basedow's name was not always cited as the primary source, his ideas on cleanliness formed the basis for subsequent discoveries in antisepsis and asepsis. Joseph Lister, the pioneer of antiseptic surgery, built upon the same fundamental principles established by Basedow. Ignaz Semmelweis, who fought puerperal fever, also confirmed the importance of hand cleanliness. Basedow didn't know about microbes, but his intuition and meticulousness allowed him to discover an invisible enemy. Medicine ceased to be the art of divination. It was becoming a science. Doctors no longer relied on ancient myths. They trusted evidence. They saw that cleanliness saved lives. From then on, every hospital, every surgeon, every patient felt this change. Progress that seemed impossible became a new reality. And it all began with one provincial physician who dared to wash his hands and trust his eyes, not old books. His discoveries saved millions of lives. They transformed medicine, turning it from an art of divination into a precise science. And yet the name of Carl von Basedow, the man who first realized the life-saving power of cleanliness, is known today only to a select few. He was overshadowed by those who came later, those who provided scientific justification for his empirical insights, who elevated his practical methods to the status of academic theories. This is the paradox of progress. The greatest, most fundamental breakthroughs often occur in the shadows, not under the flashes of glory, but as a result of persistent, unnoticed labor. And although pioneers may be forgotten, their ideas live on, in every clean scalpel, in every sterile bandage, in every life saved. This is an eternal echo. It is a lesson truth does not need loud acclaim. It simply exists. And it changes the world, even if its discoverer remains in the shadows.